It's my initial ring. I've had it for some time, and it has 14 diamonds in it, and we're going to give it away at the door as a door prize.
I see.
And everything.
And all the...
August 16th, 1977. Memphis, Tennessee. And somewhere between the moment Elvis Presley was found unresponsive on the floor of his Graceland bathroom and the moment the world was told what killed him, something happened that has never been fully explained. Not a rumor. A documented, verifiable gap in the official record that has quietly unsettled medical professionals, investigative journalists, and forensic researchers for nearly 5 decades. And it starts not at Graceland, but inside the Shelby County Medical Examiner's office, where within hours of Elvis's death, the machinery of narrative control was already in motion. Here is what most people don't know. The medical records surrounding Elvis Presley's death were not simply processed and filed the way any other case would be. Significant portions were sealed. Some were transferred out of standard public access, others remain heavily redacted to this day. And the explanation given for why, the idea that this was routine privacy protection, falls apart the moment you ask one simple question. If the cause of death was as straightforward as we were told, why was the door locked so quickly, and why has it stayed locked for this long? Let that question sit for a moment, because everything in this video flows from it. The official story, as most people know it, was cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat, a body that simply gave out. And alongside that, the acknowledgement of a prescription drug presence, a cocktail of medications found in his system that the medical examiner characterized as a contributing factor, though not the primary cause. That was the version handed to the press. That was the version that entered the history books. And for millions of grieving fans in the summer of 1977, it was the version that had to be enough, because it was the only one being offered. But Elvis Presley was 42 years old. 42. At the peak of a career that had spanned 3 decades. A man who, just months before his death, had undergone a medical evaluation that, by most accounts, did not flag him as someone in immediate mortal danger. A man who, by all outward appearances, still had years left to perform, to record, to exist. And yet the official conclusion landed with remarkable speed, remarkable certainty, and a remarkable lack of the kind of public scrutiny that a death of this magnitude should have generated. That speed is important, because here is where the record begins to crack. Dr. Jerry Francisco was the Shelby County Medical Examiner in 1977. He was the man responsible for determining the official cause of Elvis Presley's death. And what the public was never told loudly enough, what was documented but never properly amplified, is that Dr. Francisco made his public declaration about the cause of death before the full toxicology report had been completed, before the laboratory results were back, before the chemical analysis of what was actually coursing through Elvis's body at the time of his death had been fully processed and reviewed. Think about what that means. The conclusion came before the evidence. The answer was given before all the questions had been asked. And in any other context, in any case involving any other person, that sequence of events would have triggered immediate scrutiny, follow-up investigations, and demands for accountability. But this was Elvis. And in the gravitational pull of that name, that fame, that cultural weight, the normal rules of forensic procedure appeared to bend. The people closest to Elvis didn't fully accept the official story either. Not privately, not behind closed doors. There were conversations happening in the weeks and months after his death, among family members. Among members of his inner circle, that reflected a quiet but persistent discomfort with the conclusions they had been handed. A feeling that something hadn't been fully examined. A feeling that the investigation had been, in some unspoken way, guided toward a particular destination rather than allowed to arrive at one naturally. And then there were the records themselves. The sealed files. the restricted access, the documentation that should have been a matter of public medical record in a high-profile death investigation, but instead became something that required legal navigation just to approach. Families of ordinary people don't seal medical records after a sudden death. Coroners' offices don't routinely restrict access to findings in cases where the conclusion is clean and uncomplicated. Sealing happens when there is something to protect. The only question, the question this video is going to spend the next several minutes answering, is what exactly needed protecting, and who needed it protected from. Because what emerged in the years after Elvis's death, slowly, through investigative reporting and independent forensic review and the testimony of people who were inside that investigation, painted a picture that looked almost nothing like the one the public had been given. A picture that involved not just the drugs in his system, but the people who put them there, the institutions that looked away, and the documents that were quietly ensured would never tell the full story on their own. The toxicology report, the prescription records, the sealed communications. They were all pointing somewhere. And the official conclusion, delivered before the evidence was complete, was designed to make sure nobody followed the direction they were pointing. That story starts right now. When the full toxicology results finally came back, they didn't whisper. They screamed. And the people who were supposed to be listening, the officials, the gatekeepers, the medical authority figures entrusted with delivering the truth to the public, chose, in that moment, to turn the volume down. What the Baptist Memorial Hospital laboratory found inside Elvis Presley's body was not the profile of a man who died from a heart that simply stopped. It was the chemical portrait of a system that had been pushed, medicated, and overwhelmed to a degree that most physicians today describe as staggering. Not one drug. Not two. Not the kind of modest prescription presence that might reasonably sit alongside a cardiac explanation without raising questions. The toxicology screen came back positive for 14 different substances. 14. And among them, codeine was present at a level reportedly 14 times higher than what is considered the upper boundary of therapeutic dosage. 14 times. That is not a number that coexists quietly with a natural heart arrhythmia ruling. That is a number that demands its own conversation entirely. But here is where the story moves from shocking to something darker. Because those drugs didn't appear in Elvis's system by accident. They didn't come from the street. They didn't come from some shadowy source outside the reach of legitimate medicine. They were prescribed, documented, handed to Elvis Presley through the formal channels of the American medical system by a physician whose name, once you know it, becomes impossible to separate from this story. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Dr. George Nichopoulos, known to everyone around Elvis simply as Dr. Nick. He had been Elvis's personal physician for years, part of the inner circle, part of the machine that kept the king functioning well enough to perform, to travel, to exist under the crushing pressure of being Elvis Presley. And in the final 20 months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick prescribed him more than 10,000 doses of medication. 10,000 doses. In less than 2 years. Amphetamines, barbiturates, opiates, sedatives. A pharmaceutical architecture so elaborate and so relentless that it is genuinely difficult to look at it and see anything other than a system designed to keep a man sedated, functional on demand, and chemically dependent in a way that served the schedule around him rather than the body carrying it. A Tennessee Medical Board investigation was launched after Elvis's death. Dr. Nick faced scrutiny. His prescription records were examined. The volume and variety of what he had been dispensing to a single patient were laid out in plain sight. And at the end of that process, after everything that had been documented, after every number had been reviewed, he was acquitted. He continued practicing medicine for years afterward. And the question that nobody in a position of authority seemed willing to ask out loud was precisely the one that deserved the loudest answer. How does a physician prescribe that quantity of controlled substances to one patient without the system intervening long before that patient ends up dead on a bathroom floor? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, points back to the same force that shaped everything around Elvis Presley's final years. Fame, money, access. The insulation that surrounds people at a certain level of cultural power, where the normal guardrails of professional accountability quietly dissolve, because everyone in proximity has something to gain from keeping the machine running. Nick had something to gain. The concert promoters had something to gain. The managers had something to gain. And collectively, that web of mutual interest created an environment where nobody with the authority to say stop ever said it loudly enough to matter. Now here is where the sealed records re-enter the picture. Because what independent researchers and investigative journalists have established over the years is that the sealed portions of Elvis's medical documentation reportedly contain more than just test results. They contain physician communications, internal memos, prescription justifications that were written in the language of medical necessity, but that, read against the backdrop of what we now know, paint a very different picture of what was actually happening. These documents were deemed too sensitive for public release. That phrase, too sensitive, is doing an enormous amount of work in this story. Sensitive to the truth, perhaps. Sensitive to the reputations of people still living. Sensitive to an estate that had every financial incentive to ensure the legacy of Elvis Presley remained untouched by the full weight of what his final years actually looked like. And then there is Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, a man who had buried his wife years before and was now burying his only son. By every account, Vernon was devastated in ways that language cannot fully contain. But what has been documented, quietly, carefully, by people who were present in those weeks after Elvis's death, is that Vernon reportedly pushed for the investigation to be closed quickly, to be resolved, to be finalized and sealed away before the public had time to form its own conclusions. A grieving father wanting to protect his son's memory is an entirely human impulse. Nobody would deny him that. But a grieving father actively influencing the pace and scope of a death investigation is something else entirely. And the question it raises, who else was Vernon protecting and from what, is one that the sealed records may still hold the answer to. Because somewhere inside those restricted files, the full chemical story of Elvis Presley's final hours is still sitting. And the people who control access to it have never once offered a satisfying explanation for why the rest of us aren't allowed to read it. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't get celebrated. It doesn't come with applause or recognition or the comfort of knowing that history will vindicate you quickly. It comes with professional isolation, public dismissal, and the slow erosion of everything you built your career on. And in the years following Elvis Presley's death, a small number of people with medical credentials, investigative experience, and nothing personal to gain chose that kind of courage. They looked at the official record, compared it against the evidence they had examined with their own hands, and said clearly on the record, at personal cost, that the story the public had been given was not the complete truth. They were ignored. And that ignored testimony is some of the most important evidence in this entire story. When the Presley family commissioned their own independent pathological review in the aftermath of Elvis's death, 2 physicians were brought in to examine the findings separately from the official coroner's process. Dr. Noel Florendo and Dr. Brian Finkel were not fringe figures. They were not sensationalists chasing headlines or conspiracy theorists looking for a platform. They were trained forensic and toxicological professionals brought in specifically because the family, the people who loved Elvis most, sensed that the official conclusion had moved too fast and explained too little. And what both physicians found when they examined the toxicological evidence was a pattern that pointed not toward cardiac arrhythmia as a primary event, but toward the kind of acute drug toxicity that occurs when a human body is simply overwhelmed by what has been put into it. Their findings did not align with the public record. Their conclusions did not support the narrative that had already been handed to the press and absorbed by the world. And rather than triggering a re-examination of the official cause of death, those findings were quietly sidelined. The coroner's office maintained its position. The ruling stood, and the independent analysis commissioned by the very family of the deceased was folded into the growing silence surrounding everything the sealed records contained. What makes this particularly difficult to accept is not just that the findings were different. It is that they were different in a direction that implicated real people, real decisions, and a real system of pharmaceutical negligence that was still operating, still prescribing, still managing, still functioning, long after Elvis was in the ground. Acknowledging the independent findings would have meant reopening the investigation. It would have meant looking again at Dr. Nick's prescriptions, at the institutional failures that allowed them, at the web of people around Elvis who had watched his physical deterioration for years and chosen the comfort of proximity over the responsibility of intervention. The stakes of telling the truth were too high for the people positioned to tell it, so the truth got managed instead, but it didn't disappear entirely. Because there was Dan Warlick. Warlick worked the Elvis case as an investigator in 1977, and he spent the decades that followed doing something almost no one else in an official capacity had the willingness to do. He talked, publicly, consistently, and with the specificity of someone who had been inside the room where the evidence lived. Warlick stated on the record, in interviews that spanned years, that the true cause of Elvis Presley's death was polypharmacy, the toxic combination of multiple drugs at levels the human body could not survive. He was direct about his belief that the cardiac arrhythmia ruling was not a conclusion reached through evidence. It was a conclusion selected before the evidence was fully examined, and then the evidence was arranged around it. Warlick was not reckless with his words. He was methodical. He cited specifics. He referenced the toxicology data, the timeline of the official ruling, the sequence of events inside the medical examiner's office on the day the conclusion was announced. And he said plainly what others had only suggested in careful, guarded language, that something had gone wrong not just with Elvis's body, but with the process that was supposed to explain why. He was a professional making a professional accusation about a professional failure. And the response from the institutions responsible for that failure was, functionally, silence. What makes Warlick's testimony land with such weight is exactly the same thing that made the independent pathologist's findings so significant. These were not outsiders. These were not people reconstructing events from a distance using secondhand information. They were inside the investigation. They handled the documentation. They saw what the sealed records contained before the sealing happened, and every one of them, in their own way, reached the same destination. The official story was incomplete. And the incompleteness was not accidental. And then there is the detail that sits heaviest of all. Because in the weeks before August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley himself appears to have known that something was deeply wrong. People who were close to him in that final period, friends, confidants, members of the inner circle who have spoken carefully over the years, described a man who seemed to carry a quiet awareness of his own deterioration. There were conversations that took the shape of goodbye without using the word. There were moments of unusual stillness from a man who had spent his entire adult life in motion. And there were, reportedly, written reflections, private thoughts committed to paper that suggested Elvis understood, on some level, that the pharmaceutical world being managed around him was not sustainable. A man who could sense what was coming, who perhaps knew, better than anyone, exactly what was being done to his body. The most valuable thing Elvis possessed was the idea of Elvis. The myth, the untouchable, undeniable, larger-than-life construct that had been built around the actual human being like a gilded cage. And anything, any piece of footage, any recorded conversation, any unscripted moment that showed the human being instead of the construct was, in Parker's calculus, a direct threat to the asset. So it disappeared. Quietly, legally, completely. What makes this particularly suffocating when you trace it through the documented record is that Parker's suppression wasn't limited to obviously damaging material. He wasn't just pulling footage that showed Elvis in crisis or conflict. He was pulling footage that showed Elvis being brilliant in ways that contradicted the commercial direction Parker had chosen for him. Rehearsal footage that revealed a musical intelligence that didn't fit the Vegas showman narrative. Conversation recordings that showed an intellectual depth that complicated the simple, accessible, non-threatening image Parker had spent years carefully constructing. Even moments of genuine joy, unperformed, unmanaged, real, got locked away because joy, real joy, implies a full human interior. And a full human interior is harder to package than a myth. Then there is the estate. And this requires a careful, honest conversation, because the people who have managed Elvis's legacy since 1977 have done genuine work, preserving recordings, authorizing documentaries, maintaining an archive that might otherwise have scattered completely in the decades after his death. That work is real and it matters. But preservation and access are not the same thing. And the criteria by which the estate has historically determined what gets released, what gets licensed, and what stays in the vault have never been fully transparent. What we can say, based on the documented record of what has and hasn't been made available over nearly 5 decades, is that the footage most likely to complicate the approved narrative. The footage that shows Elvis pushing back, breaking down, speaking plainly about the conditions of his own life, has consistently been the footage least likely to surface through official channels. Whether that reflects a deliberate policy or simply the natural institutional conservatism of an organization protecting a billion-dollar brand is a question that deserves a far more direct answer than it has ever received. The machine that controlled Elvis, how a legal and commercial empire buried the truth, and beneath all of this sits the legal and commercial architecture that made indefinite suppression not just possible, but structurally inevitable. Copyright law, estate control, and the licensing infrastructure built around Elvis's image created a system where the people with the strongest financial interest in controlling the narrative, and who, by that point, may have been too deep inside the system built around him to find a way out. That is not the story of a heart that simply stopped. That is the story of a man who was failed, deliberately, systematically, and with full knowledge by the people closest to him. Here is something that should stop you completely. Right now, today, as you are watching this video, the full medical records surrounding Elvis Presley's death are still not available to the public. Not partially restricted, not pending a scheduled release. Still sealed, still controlled, still sitting behind legal and institutional walls that have held firm for nearly 5 decades, surviving every shift in public records law, every freedom of information request, and every investigative push that journalists and researchers have mounted against them. And the entity that sits at the center of that control, the organization that has the most direct influence over what gets released and what stays buried, is Elvis Presley Enterprises, the corporate body that manages the King's legacy, his image, his music, and apparently the story of how he died. That is not a coincidence. That is a decision. And it is a decision that has been made, renewed, and defended every single year since 1977. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what Elvis Presley Enterprises actually is and what it has always been designed to protect. It is not simply a music catalog management company. It is a brand protection machine of extraordinary sophistication, built around the singular task of ensuring that Elvis Presley, the image, the icon, the cultural monument, remains commercially viable, emotionally untarnished, and narratively controlled. Graceland generates tens of millions of dollars annually. The licensing agreements, the merchandise, the tourism, the streaming royalties, they all depend on a version of Elvis that the public can love without complication. And a full, unfiltered accounting of his final months, the pharmaceutical dependency, the institutional negligence, the people who watched him deteriorate and said nothing, is not a story that serves that version. So the records stay sealed, and the narrative stays managed. And every year that passes without full disclosure is another year that the complete truth about how Elvis Presley died remains the exclusive property of the people who have the most financial reason to keep it that way. But the researchers haven't stopped. The investigators haven't walked away. And in recent years, a new generation of forensic journalists and independent analysts have approached the sealed record from a different angle. Not trying to break the wall down directly, but working around it. Cross-referencing pharmacy dispensing records from the Memphis area in 1977 against what is publicly known about Elvis's prescriptions. Triangulating the timeline of his physical decline against the documented prescription volumes. Filing targeted Freedom of Information requests not for the sealed medical documents themselves, but for the administrative correspondence surrounding the sealing decision, who authorized it, on what grounds, and with what justification. What those efforts have surfaced in fragments is deeply unsettling. There are indications within the accessible portions of the administrative record that the decision to restrict certain documents was made with unusual speed, not as a routine privacy measure applied after careful review, but as a proactive containment effort initiated almost simultaneously with the death investigation itself. There are references in tangential documents to physician communications that were separated from the main file early in the process. Communications that would normally be considered part of the evidentiary record in a death investigation of this nature. And there are gaps, deliberate documented gaps, in the chain of custody for certain laboratory results that forensic professionals who have reviewed the available record describe as irregular at best and deeply suspicious at worst. What those fragments point toward, collectively, is a picture of Elvis's final days that the official record has never fully acknowledged. A picture in which the pharmaceutical situation around him was not simply a personal struggle with addiction, but an actively managed chemical dependency maintained by people with professional credentials and personal incentives. A picture in which the warning signs were not invisible, they were seen, documented, and overridden by a system that needed Elvis functional enough to perform and sedated enough to be manageable. And a picture in which the hours immediately preceding his death may contain details that would, if fully disclosed, reframe not just the cause of death, but the moral culpability of multiple individuals who have never faced meaningful accountability. Because that is ultimately what this story is about. Not just Elvis. Not just one man's tragedy, as profound and as painful as that tragedy genuinely is. It is about what happens when fame constructs a fortress around a human being so impenetrable that even the basic protections of medical ethics and legal accountability cannot get inside. It is about the system, the managers, the physicians, the enablers, the gatekeepers that forms around a person of that magnitude and begins slowly and then all at once to serve itself rather than the person at its center. Elvis Presley did not die in a vacuum. He died inside a machine. And the machine, remarkably, survived him. The records are still sealed. The requests are still being denied. And somewhere in a filing system that the public has never been permitted to fully access, the unedited, unredacted, complete account of how the most famous entertainer who ever lived spent his final hours is sitting exactly where it was placed in the days after August 16, 1977. Placed there deliberately, kept there intentionally by people and institutions that understood from the very beginning that the full truth was too damaging to survive in the open. Elvis deserved better. The truth deserved better. And nearly 50 years later, the least we can do is refuse to stop asking for it. If this video opened your eyes to something you never knew about Elvis, don't let the algorithm bury it. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with one person who thinks they already know the whole story. The next video goes even deeper, and you do not want to miss it.